The moment Della Langley saw the man fall off her roof, she dropped her flour sack and ran like the devil himself was behind her, which, as she would later reflect, was not entirely the wrong metaphor for Henry Wells. It was the autumn of 1879, and Copper Creek, Texas, was the kind of small town that wore its ambitions on its sleeve and its failures on its face. The main street had a dry goods store, a livery stable, a saloon that tried to be respectable and failed miserably at it, a church that tried to be forgiving and did only slightly better, and the railroad tracks that everyone promised would bring prosperity and mostly brought dust and disappointment. The land around it was wide and golden in October, the kind of landscape that looked like God had taken a deep breath and held it, all prairie grass and limestone hills, and the occasional mesquite tree twisting up from the clay like it had something important to say. Della had been living in the little white house on the eastern edge of town for 2 years by then, ever since her husband Thomas had died of a fever that swept through that spring and took him in a week, leaving her with a small piece of land, a mule named Copernicus, a modest savings that she stretched like taffy, and the particular kind of loneliness that settles into a woman's bones when she realizes the future she had built in her mind is now a room she will never enter. She was 26 years old, with dark brown hair that she pinned up every morning with the same practiced efficiency she brought to everything in her life, and eyes that were the color of good creek water, green and brown and honest. She was not soft. The frontier had seen to that. But she was not hard either. She had simply become the kind of woman who knew the difference between what she could fix and what she had to live with. The chimney had been giving her trouble since August. It drew poorly on warm days and sent smoke curling back into the kitchen, until her curtains smelled like a campfire, and her eyes watered through every meal. She had stuffed rags around the base, poured water down the flue to clear any blockage, and asked old Harlan Briggs at the dry goods store what she ought to do. And Harlan had squinted at her from beneath eyebrows so bushy they seemed to have their own opinions, and said that what she needed was somebody to go up there and clear the cap and check the crown mortar, because that was where the trouble usually started. She had thanked him and gone home and stared at the roof for a long time, because Della Langley was not afraid of climbing, but she was afraid of leaving her mule unattended and her land uncared for if she fell and broke something important. She had mentioned it to no one in particular, which meant she had mentioned it to everyone, because that was how small towns worked. Word traveled in Copper Creek the way creek water traveled after a good rain, fast and finding every low place, and apparently word had reached Henry Wells. She did not know Henry Wells. She knew of him, the way she knew of most people in town, in the surface way of a woman who came to the market on Saturdays and attended church on Sundays and otherwise kept herself to herself. She knew he had ridden into Copper Creek about 6 months ago, that he had taken a room at the boarding house run by Mrs. Eliza Crane, that he did odd jobs and ranch work and had a reputation for being handy with tools and honest in his dealings. She knew he was maybe 29 or 30, lean and sun-browned, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes that were the particular shade of blue that made people think of open sky. She had noticed him the way you notice anything that doesn't quite fit the picture you've drawn in your head of a place, a detail that keeps pulling your eye without your permission. She had not expected him to show up at her gate on a Tuesday morning with a ladder over his shoulder and a leather tool bag swinging from his hand, wearing a battered hat with a sweat stain along the band and boots that had seen serious use, looking like the most natural thing in the world was for him to come fix a stranger's chimney. "Miss Langley," he said, and he touched the brim of his hat, not in a performative way but in a way that was simply courteous, like breathing. "I heard you were having trouble with your chimney flue. I've got a free morning and I'm decent with masonry. I thought I'd come take a look if you'll have me." Della had been standing on her porch with a mixing bowl, having been in the middle of making bread, and she looked at him for a moment with the careful assessment of a woman who had learned that generosity from strangers usually came with a price attached somewhere, even if you had to wait to find out where. Who told you? She said. Harlan Briggs, he said, and then after a pause, and also Mrs. Crane, who heard it from the Reverend's wife, who heard it from you directly. Della felt the corner of her mouth pull up despite herself. So the whole town knows my chimney is broken. The whole town knows you need a hand with it, he said, and there was no condescension in it, just fact delivered plainly. There's a difference. She looked at him for another moment. The morning light was coming over the hills to the east, and it hit the side of his face and the tool bag and the ladder in a way that made everything look simple and clear and purposeful. And Della Langley, who prided herself on reading situations correctly, felt something shift in her chest that she did not immediately have a name for. "Well," she said, "I suppose you'd better come look at it then." He propped the ladder against the side of the house with the efficiency of a man who had done this 1,000 times, checked that it was set firm against the clay soil, and climbed. He climbed well. She noticed that too, against her better judgment, the way he moved with a kind of unhurried confidence, like the roof was just another piece of ground and gravity was only a suggestion. He got to the top and crouched near the chimney cap and spent a few minutes up there, and she could hear him working, the scrape of a trowel, the sound of brick dust falling. She went back inside to check her bread dough, telling herself she was not listening for him on the roof, and then spent the next 10 minutes very clearly listening for him on the roof. She heard him move, heard the shift of weight on the old cedar shingles, heard a sound that she would later describe as something between a slide and a lurch and a very brief and almost dignified attempt to correct course, and then she heard the crash. It was not a full crash. She would think about this later, turning it over like a river stone. It was not the sound of a man hitting the ground with the full and terrible weight of gravity behind him. It was something interrupted, something broken up, and when she burst out the kitchen door, mixing bowl still in hand because she had forgotten she was holding it, what she saw was Henry Wells hanging from the edge of the roof by one arm with his feet still scrabbling at the wall below him and his tool bag swinging in an arc from where it had caught on a nail, and the ladder lying flat on the ground 6 feet away. She did not think. She dropped the bowl, she grabbed the ladder from where it had fallen, and she heaved it up against the wall with strength that surprised her and probably surprised him, and she said, in a voice that was remarkably steady for a woman whose heart was hammering loud enough to drown out the morning birds, "Put your foot on the 3rd rung." He found the rung. He got his feet under him. He came down the ladder with the controlled, deliberate movement of a man swallowing his pride along with his relief, and when he reached the ground he stood there for a moment with his hands on the ladder rails and his chest moving faster than usual, and then he looked at her. "Well," he said. "Well," she said. "I slipped on some loose mortar. I can see that. I had it mostly handled." She looked at the ladder on the ground where it had been, and then at the 6 feet of open air between where the ladder had been and where he was now standing, and she raised one eyebrow in a way that conveyed everything without requiring a single word. He had the grace to look slightly embarrassed. "I'm grateful for the assist," he said. "You're welcome," she said. "Are you hurt?" He checked himself with the practiced self-inventory of a man who had been in physical scrapes before, rolling his wrist, pressing his elbow where it had caught the shingles, and then he said, "Nothing that won't be fine by tomorrow." "Come inside," she said. "I'll look at that elbow." He opened his mouth as if to decline, which was the predictable thing, the polite thing, the thing a man did when he felt he had already imposed, and then he looked at her face, which must have communicated something he was not inclined to argue with, and he closed his mouth and followed her inside. The kitchen was warm and smelled of bread dough and wood smoke, though lighter on the smoke than usual because of the warm morning and the back door being open. Della got a cloth and the small bottle of whiskey she kept for medicinal purposes, and she sat him down at the kitchen table and looked at his elbow, which had a long scrape across it that had bled enough to be meaningful. She cleaned it efficiently and without fuss, and he sat quietly and let her do it, which she appreciated more than she expected to. "You didn't finish the chimney," she said, not unkindly. "No," he agreed. though I got the worst of the blockage out before the latter had other ideas. Your draw should be better. I can come back and do the mortar work properly. You don't have to do that. I know I don't, he said, and then he looked at her with those blue eyes that were entirely too direct for a man she barely knew, but I'd like to. Something moved through the kitchen that was not the morning breeze, and Della felt it and chose not to acknowledge it, the way you choose not to look directly at the sun even when it's exactly where you want to look. I'll make coffee, she said, and she stood up and went to the stove. His name, she found out over that first cup of coffee at her kitchen table, was Henry James Wells, and he was from Missouri originally, a small town called Fayette that she had never heard of, which he said was entirely appropriate because most people hadn't. His father had been a carpenter, and his mother had kept the books for the family business, and he had grown up learning both, the practical use of wood and nail, and the more abstract use of numbers and ledgers. He had come west for reasons that he described with a certain careful vagueness that Della recognized as the language of a man who had left something behind, and she did not press him on it, because she recognized in him the same quality she had in herself, the settled knowledge that some things are yours to carry alone until you decide they aren't. He was funny, she discovered in the dry, understated way that she liked best, the kind of humor that hid itself in plain sentences and only revealed itself a beat later when you were already past it. He drank his coffee black, and without comment on the fact that her cups did not match, and he noticed things about the kitchen, the way the shelves were built, the clever system she had rigged with a hook and a rope to keep the back door from swinging in the wind, and he commented on them with the admiration of someone who recognized good practical thinking, which made her feel seen in a way she had not expected. He left an hour later, touching his hat again at the gate, and she stood on the porch and watched him go with the mixing bowl she had retrieved from the yard and tried to identify the feeling that was sitting in her chest like a warm coal. She decided it was simply gratitude, because that was the sensible thing. She was wrong, but she gave herself some time to figure that out. He came back the following Saturday with fresh mortar and the proper tools, and he finished the chimney cap in 2 hours, working carefully and without any further incidents involving gravity. And Della made lunch, which she had not planned to do and then found herself doing anyway, because it seemed inhospitable not to feed a man who was doing work on her roof. She made salt pork and cornbread and sliced the last of her stored tomatoes from the garden, and they sat at the same table as before, and the conversation came even easier the second time, the way water finds an already cut channel. He told her about ranch work, about the rhythm of it, the pre-dawn starts, and the way the land looked at first light when the sky was still pulling itself together. And he told her about a horse he had been working with at the Morrison Ranch north of town, a sorrel gelding named Absalom who had a tendency to bolt at sudden sounds, and who had apparently bolted at the sound of a tin bucket falling over that week and sent Henry over a fence rail and into a water trough. "That's twice you've fallen this week," Della said. "That's an accurate accounting," he said. "You might consider a profession more closely associated with the ground," she said. He laughed. It was a good laugh, not performed, just real, and it did something to the quality of the air in the room. "My mother used to say I had more determination than coordination," he said. "I think she had a point." "You seem coordinated enough," Della said, and then wished she hadn't because it sounded like a compliment she had not meant to give out loud, but he only nodded, accepting it with a simplicity that saved them both from any awkwardness. They talked about Copper Creek. He asked about the town, about its character, its history, and she found herself telling him things she did not normally volunteer, about how the town had felt when she first arrived with Thomas, how it had seemed both smaller and larger than expected, smaller in its geography and larger in the weight of its opinions. She told him about the pastor, Reverend Gill, who was a good man but spoke too long and meant well and occasionally ran afoul of both. She told him about the Ortega family who ran the laundry and who were treated with the particular kind of polite dismissiveness that passed for tolerance in a town that did not always examine its own assumptions. And she said so plainly because she was a plain-spoken woman, and she watched his face when she said it, which was the test she had been running without quite admitting it. He nodded seriously, without qualification. "That's a common cruelty," he said, "dressed up to look like courtesy." She nodded too, and the conversation moved on, but something had been established between them, a shared willingness to see things as they were. When he left that second Saturday, he paused at the gate and said, "The chimney should be right now. No more smoke in your kitchen." "Thank you," she said, and she meant more than the chimney. "If anything else gives you trouble," he said, and then he stopped and looked at his hat instead of at her for a moment and then looked back. "I'd be glad to help is all." She watched him walk down the road toward town, and the afternoon light caught his shadow long behind him, and Copernicus, the mule, ambled over to the fence to watch him go too, which Della chose to interpret as the mule being bored rather than the mule expressing any editorial opinion about the man. She stood there longer than was strictly necessary. October deepened. The mornings grew colder, and the chimney worked beautifully, drawing clean and true, and the kitchen stayed clear of smoke, and Della thought about this every morning when she lit the fire, which meant she thought about Henry Wells every morning, which was something she worked to be sensible about and mostly failed at. He came to church on the third Sunday of October, which was not unusual except that she had never seen him there before, and he sat 3 pews back and 1 over, where she could see him if she turned her head at a natural angle, which she told herself she was not doing on purpose, and which she was absolutely doing on purpose. He caught her looking once and gave a small nod, and she faced forward and listened to Reverend Gill explain a passage from Proverbs with more vigor than the passage strictly required. After the service, in the bright, cold yard outside the church where people gathered to talk and the children ran, and the women compared recipes, and the men debated cattle prices and weather, Henry Wells walked toward her with a kind of deliberate but not quite casual purpose, and the people around her who had been talking seemed to find other things to look at, because small towns were nothing if not efficient at noticing things. "Good morning, Miss Langley," he said. "Good morning, Mr. Wells," she said. "Your chimney holding up perfectly," she said, "not a trace of smoke." "Good," he said, and then there was a pause during which they were both clearly aware that the chimney had been thoroughly established as a topic, and they were now somewhere else, in a conversational space without an obvious road, and they both seemed to feel it at the same time, and she saw something in his face that she recognized because she felt it in herself, a kind of careful wanting, held back by the knowledge that wanting things too quickly was how people got hurt. "There's a harvest social next Saturday at the Grange Hall," he said, and he said it looking at her with a directness that was both nerve-steadying and nerve-shaking at once. "I'd be honored if you'd allow me to escort you." Della looked at him. She thought about Thomas, the way she thought about Thomas every time something good presented itself to her since he died, not with grief exactly anymore, more with the sense of measuring what he would have thought, what he would have wanted for her. Thomas had been a generous man. He had wanted her happiness with a sincerity that had been one of his finest qualities. "I'd like that," she said. He smiled. It changed his whole face, the way sunlight changes the character of a landscape, and she had a sudden sense that she had not quite known what she was agreeing to, that the smile was a preview of something larger, a glimpse of a season she had not yet arrived in. "Saturday, then," he said, and touched his hat, and stepped away to talk to Harlan Briggs, who had been watching the whole exchange with the barely concealed delight of a man who had engineered the initial meeting and wanted credit for it. The week passed in the way weeks pass when there is something at the end of them you are trying not to think about too much, slowly in the first days, and then faster toward the end as your patience runs out. Della mended her blue dress, which was the nicest thing she had, a deep cornflower blue that she had made herself from cloth bought in San Antonio the year she married, and she pressed it and hung it on the door and told herself firmly that she was not making too much of a harvest social at the Grange Hall. She made too much of it anyway, in the private country of her own heart, in the way you do when something has started and you know it has started, and the only question is where it is going. He came for her at 6 o'clock sharp, which told her something about him, a man who was on time for things he cared about. He wore a clean white shirt and his best trousers and a dark jacket that she guessed was not new but had been brushed and pressed until it held itself properly. And his boots had been polished, and he had gotten a haircut since Sunday. And when she came to the door he looked at her in her blue dress for a moment in a way that said more than he offered in words, which was fine, because the look was enough. "You look lovely," he said, and he said it simply without decoration, and it landed in her chest clean and warm. "You clean up well yourself," she said, and he smiled again, that same smile, and offered his arm, and she took it. The Grange Hall was lit with lanterns strung from the rafters and smelled of sawdust and apple cider and the combined perfume of 30 people in close quarters. And a fiddle player named Jasper Collins was sawing away at a reel in the corner with more enthusiasm than technical precision, but enough genuine joy to make up for it. There were tables of food along one wall, pies and corn dishes and pickled things in jars, and a haunch of beef that the Morrison family had contributed, and children darted between legs and couples danced in the open center of the floor, and the whole thing had the particular warmth of a community that knew it needed each other to get through the coming winter and was being glad about it together. People noticed them arrive together. Of course they did. Mrs. Crane from the boarding house raised her eyebrows in a meaningful direction at her friend, Mrs. Pickett, and Harlan Briggs looked satisfied in the way of a man whose work is done. And Reverend Gill's wife smiled a particular kind of smile that meant she already had opinions about weddings, which was premature and also, Della thought, not entirely off the mark in some private corner of her soul that she was not ready to examine yet. They got cider from the table and stood together and talked, and the ease that had characterized their conversations in her kitchen translated perfectly to the social air of the Grange Hall, comfortable and warm and peppered with observations about the people around them that they shared in low voices and found amusing in the same ways. He made her laugh twice in the first quarter hour, genuinely, with her head tipped back, and she felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't realized had been tight. When Jasper Collins shifted from reels to something slower, Henry turned to her and held out his hand and asked if she would dance, and she said she was not much of a dancer, and he said he was not much either, and they danced anyway, which meant they moved together in the general direction of the music, and occasionally achieved something resembling the correct steps, and generally did not mind when they didn't. He held her with a careful propriety that she appreciated and a nearness that she also appreciated, and they talked as they danced, low and close, about small things that felt significant, and she was aware of the smell of him, something clean and plain, and the warmth of his hand at her back, and the way he was looking at her face when he thought she was looking somewhere else. She was not looking somewhere else. When the dance ended, they stepped apart with the mutual, unspoken acknowledgement of two people who had registered something important and were going to take their time with it. And they went back to the cider table and talked to other people, and occasionally caught each other's eyes across the room in the way that meant the conversation had not actually stopped, only relocated. He walked her home at the end of the evening under a sky full of stars so dense and clear they looked painted, the kind of sky that only happened on cold, dry October nights, and they walked slowly, slower than the distance required, and talked about everything and nothing, and when they reached her gate and stopped, the silence between them held none of the awkwardness of uncertainty and all of the weight of something beginning. "I had a fine time," she said. "So did I," he said. There was a pause. The night was very quiet. Somewhere down the road, an owl was working through its repertoire. "Della," he said, and the use of her given name for the first time was gentle, as if he had picked it up carefully, aware of what it cost to say it. I'm going to be straightforward with you because I think you're a woman who prefers that." "I am," she said. "I haven't had an evening like tonight in a long time," he said. "And I think you know what I mean, and I think you feel something similar, and I don't want to assume too much or move faster than you're comfortable with. But I want you to know that I'm not here for a season. I'm not a man who passes through." She looked at him for a long moment. The starlight fell across them both, and the night was cold on her cheeks, and the gate was cool under her gloved hand, and she thought of how she had stood at the gate before and watched him walk away and felt something she hadn't named. "I know you're not," she said. "I think that's what I'm reckoning with." He nodded, accepting this as the honest thing it was, not pressing for more, and she loved him a little bit for that, not a large love yet, but the first small true piece of it, the kind that grows from respect. "Good night, Della," he said. "Good night, Henry," she said, and went inside and stood in her dark kitchen for a full minute before she lit the lamp. November arrived with all the brisk authority of a season that has things to accomplish, and with it came a shift in the way Henry and Della moved through the life of Copper Creek. It was not sudden or dramatic. It was the gradual convergence of two people who had decided, without saying so in so many words, to go in the same direction for a while and see where it led. He started coming to her property more regularly, not with the excuse of the chimney now, but with offers of help that were genuine, and that she accepted because she was a practical woman, and there was always work to be done on a small holding in the weeks before winter. He split firewood on 3 consecutive Saturdays, working through the morning with a steady rhythm that she watched sometimes from the kitchen window while pretending to tend to other things. He fixed the gate latch that had been stiff since spring, and he looked at the foundation on the east side of the house where water pooled after rain, and rerouted a small drainage ditch that solved the problem so elegantly it almost annoyed her because she hadn't thought of it herself. She fed him lunch every time because she was not going to let a man do labor on her land without feeding him, and because lunch had become the best part of her week, sitting across the table from him with the food between them and the afternoon coming in through the window and the conversation going wherever it wanted to go. They talked about everything. About his time in Missouri and what the land looked like there, greener and softer than Texas, a landscape of river bottoms and oak timber that he described with a certain affection that told her he missed it some. About his father, who had died 3 years ago, and his mother who lived with his sister in St. Louis now and who wrote letters in a firm, clear hand that he showed Della one afternoon because she had asked about her, his mother's voice coming through the ink in the way of a woman who was practical and funny and deeply concerned about whether her son was eating properly. "She'd like you," he said, with a certainty that he seemed to realize was perhaps too revealing, and he looked down at his coffee cup for a moment. "You've told her about me," Della said, keeping her voice carefully level. "In a letter," he said, still looking at the cup. "I mentioned I'd been doing some work for a neighbor and that she was good company." "Good company," Della repeated. He looked up then, and the blue eyes were direct and a little braver than the rest of him in that moment. "I may have used stronger language than that." She felt warmth move up her throat and resolutely directed her attention to her bread. She told him about Thomas. She did this one afternoon in early November when the sky had gone the color of pewter, and the first suggestion of real winter was in the air. And she told him plainly and without excessive sorrow, not because she didn't still feel it, but because she had processed enough of it to be able to speak of it without it swallowing her. And she told him what Thomas had been like, the good parts and the difficult parts, his patience and his occasional stubbornness, and the way he had loved her with a steady, undemonstrative devotion that had been the framework of her adult life, and whose absence had left her for a long time like a building without walls. Henry listened to all of it without interrupting, without offering sympathy in the performed way that people sometimes did, just listening, and when she finished he said, "He sounds like a man worth grieving properly." "He was," she said. "And you have," he said. She looked at him. It was a statement, not a question, and she heard in it the thing he was not quite saying, the careful, tentative thing, and she felt the truth of his statement settle in her, that yes, she had grieved properly, that she had done the full work of it, that whatever she was feeling now was not disloyalty to Thomas, but the continuation of a life that Thomas himself would have insisted on. "Yes," she said, "I have." The conversation moved elsewhere, but something had been laid down between them, a foundation as solid as the new mortar on her chimney. It was on a Wednesday in mid-November that he told her about why he had left Missouri. They were outside, she feeding the chickens and he replacing a rotten board on the coop, and the afternoon was cold and gray and intimate in the way that gray, cold days can be, enclosed and quiet, and he started talking almost as if he were thinking out loud, and she fed the chickens and listened. He had been engaged, he told her, to a woman named Clara Bishop in Fayette for 2 years. He had built them a house, done the work himself over a year and a half, and the wedding had been set for April of 1878. And Clara had left, not for another man, nothing so clear and causable as that, but because she had decided she did not want the life she saw ahead of her, the smallness of Fayette, the carpentry and the ledger books and the constancy of it, and she had told him so with a brutal honesty that he had appreciated less at the time than he did now, and she had gone to live with a cousin in Cincinnati. He drove in the last nail before he continued. "I finished the house," he said, "because stopping felt worse. And then I sold it to my brother-in-law for a fair price, and I came west because I thought distance and new air might make the shape of things clearer." "And did they?" Della said. He straightened and looked at her. He was holding a hammer and the gray sky was behind him, and he said, "Clearer every day." She looked back at the chickens so he would not see that the warmth he caused in her had reached her face. He was invited to Thanksgiving at her table, along with Mrs. Crane and Harlan Briggs, who were her nearest friends in town, and the afternoon was full and loud and good, and the turkey was imperfect and the gravy was excellent, and Harlan told 3 different stories about his youth in Kentucky that contradicted each other in small but notable ways, and Mrs. Crane won 2 consecutive arguments about the proper preparation of sweet potatoes, and Henry sat at Della's table and laughed and passed dishes and helped clear up after, drying dishes beside her at the basin. Their shoulders occasionally close, and it was the most natural thing in the world, and the most frightening, in the particular way of things that feel like they fit exactly right, because fitting exactly right means you have something to lose. He was the last to leave, helping her carry the extra chairs back to the parlor, and they stood in the kitchen afterward in the quiet that follows a full afternoon, and he said, "Thank you for having me." "Thank you for being here," she said, and meant it in more ways than one. He stood there for a moment, hat in his hands, turning it the way men do when they're working up to something or working it through, and then he said, "Della, I think you know what's happening between us." "I think I do," she said, and her voice was steady because she had decided to be brave. "I'm not asking for anything sudden," he said, and the care in it made her chest ache in a good way. "But I want you to know that what I feel is real, and it is not going to change because of weather or time or circumstance. It's the kind of thing that waits." She looked at him for a long moment in the lamplight of her kitchen, this man who had fallen off her roof and been honest about it and fixed it properly afterward and come back every week since, who had listened to her talk about Thomas and told her about Clara and split her firewood and laughed at the same things she laughed at. And she thought that the whole of her life had been building in the direction of this kitchen, and this moment, and this man standing in it, and that some things that look like accident are, in fact, entirely designed. "Henry," she said, and she took one step forward, just one, but it was enough, and he understood it the way a person understands plain speech, and he closed the remaining distance and kissed her, gently, briefly, with a precision and a care that felt like a promise being written, and when he stepped back they were both very quiet. "Well," he said. "Well," she said, and they looked at each other and neither of them needed to say anything else about it. December came in cold and hard, with the first real freeze settling over Copper Creek in the first week, and the town drew in on itself in the way of small communities in winter, closer together physically and more dependent on each other, which suited Della and Henry perfectly, because it meant that his reasons for being at her property became even more practical and therefore even more frequent, helping with the water lines that needed checking in the freeze, ensuring the coop was weatherproofed, bringing extra wood, and checking that her supply would last the season. But beyond the practical, there was simply the pleasure of each other, which grew the way good things grow, steadily and with increasing root depth, so that by December's middle Della found herself thinking of Henry not as something new in her life, but as something that had always been there in potential, waiting to be actual. They had their first real quarrel on a Wednesday in the second week of December, which Della later considered a good sign, because it meant they were being real with each other. She had been approached by a man named Gerald Prescott, who owned considerable land west of town, and who had expressed an interest in buying her property, her particular 40 acres being positioned in a way that would be useful for the expansion of his range, and he had made a good offer, enough to let her live comfortably somewhere else for years. She mentioned it to Henry, thinking he would engage with it as information, and instead he went quiet in a way that was not his comfortable quiet but a different kind, a pulled-back kind, and when she pressed him on it he said, with a careful restraint that told her the restraint was working hard, "I think you should do what's right for you." "I'm asking what you think," she said. "I think you should consider it." "Henry, what do you want me to say, Della?" "I want you to say what you actually think," she said, and her voice had gone the tone it went when she was not going to be managed. He set down the mug he was holding and looked at her directly. "All right," he said. "I think you'd be selling the place where you built something and leaving the town where people know you and value you. And I don't think Gerald Prescott is offering you what that's actually worth. And I think," he said, and there was something unsteady in his voice, something that made it human and real, "that if you leave Copper Creek I'd be coming with you, but I'd prefer not to have to make that choice just yet." The kitchen was very quiet. "You'd come with me," she said. "Of course I would," he said, as if this was entirely obvious. She looked at him for a long moment, and something that had been living in the question space of herself settled finally into the answer space, and she said, "I'm not selling the land." His exhale was very quiet, but she heard it. "Good," he said. "And you could have just said all of that from the beginning," she said. "I know it," he said, with the rueful honesty of a man who has identified his own failing. "I was trying not to influence you. By being deliberately unhelpful," she said. "In retrospect, yes," he said. She handed him his mug back. "Don't do that again," she said. "No," he agreed, and the warmth was back in his eyes. "I won't." They sent a message back to Gerald Prescott declining his offer, and that was the end of that. He gave her a Christmas gift, a small, plain book of poetry by Walt Whitman, which was not the kind of thing she had expected but was exactly the kind of thing she wanted. And inside the front cover he had written in his careful carpenter's hand, "For Della, who is herself a kind of poem." She read the inscription 3 times standing at the tree she had put up in the parlor corner, and then she set the book down and went and found him in the yard where he was seeing to Copernicus. And she walked up to him and kissed him with a directness that made the mule shuffle his feet in surprise, and Henry laughed against her mouth, and it was the happiest she had been in a long, long time. She gave him a new pair of leather work gloves she had stitched herself, which she worried was too plain a gift, and he put them on immediately and wore them for the rest of the day, and treated them with a care that told her they were not plain to him at all. The new year came, 1880, and with it the quality of their relationship shifted again, the way seasons shift, not with a clear line but with a gradual change of light and temperature that you one day realize has completed itself. They were, by January, simply a known and accepted fact in Copper Creek, the way the morning train and the Ortega laundry and Harlan Briggs's opinions were known and accepted facts. People spoke of them as a pair. Women mentioned Della's name to Henry and Henry's name to Della as if the names were already linked by grammar. Reverend Gill stopped Henry after the service one January Sunday with an air of casual certainty, and asked if he and Miss Langley had any particular plans for the spring. And Henry, to his credit, told him that was their own business respectfully, and came to tell Della about it immediately after, and they laughed about it walking home in the cold air, and Della thought how very good it was to have someone to laugh with. He had taken on more regular work by January, partnering with a man named Frank Delacourt, who ran a building and repair business out of a workshop on the north side of Main Street. Henry's carpentry skills and Frank's plumbing knowledge made them useful to the expanding town, and there was enough work to keep both of them busy and Henry to begin saving with a purpose that he had not had since the house in Fayette, though this purpose had a different shape and a better foundation. He told her about his savings one February afternoon, with a directness that told her he wanted her to understand what he was doing and why. "I've got enough saved to put up a decent house on a proper lot," he said, "within the year if work keeps steady." She looked at him over her coffee cup, and he looked back at her over his, and neither of them said the rest of it out loud, but it was there in the kitchen between them, substantial and warm, the future they were both already building in the privacy of their own minds. "Frank says there's a good lot on the northwest edge of town," he continued, studying his cup. "Good soil, good water access, decent shade trees." "That does sound like a good lot," Della said. "It'd be close to your property," he said, "if a person wanted to be near it." "That's a practical consideration," she said. He looked up. There was something in his eyes that was both nervous and certain, the combination of feelings that belongs exclusively to a man about to say something irrevocable. "Della," he said, "I have a specific reason for telling you all this." "I imagined you might," she said. He put his cup down, he straightened his back. He said in the direct, plain way that was entirely his, "I want to marry you. I'm not asking yet, because I want to have more than I have now to bring to it, and because I want to ask you properly when the time is right. But I want you to know that I'm working toward it, and that I am entirely serious, and that I love you." The word landed in the room like a stone landing in still water, sending rings out to every wall. She looked at him, this man who had fallen off her roof and accepted her help getting down and come back the following week to finish the job, who had drunk 100 cups of coffee at her table and split her firewood and listened to her grief and told her his own and made her laugh and kissed her in her kitchen on a Thanksgiving evening and written her name inside a book of poetry and worn her gloves with pride. And she felt the full sum of the past months add up to this moment. And the total was unmistakable. "I love you too," she said, and her voice was clear and steady because she had decided to stop being careful and just be true. "And I think you should know that I'm not waiting on a house or a lot or any particular amount of savings. I'm waiting on you." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he got up from his chair and came around the table and took her hands in his, the new leather gloves making his hands large and warm around hers, and he said, "Then I won't make you wait long." He did not make her wait long. In the last week of February, on a Sunday afternoon when the winter was beginning to make the small, subtle concessions that meant spring was on its way, when the light came at a slightly different angle and the soil smelled of something thawing, Henry Wells came to Della Langley's door dressed in his best and carrying a small package wrapped in brown paper, and when she opened the door he did not come inside. He stood on the porch, which was where they had started, and he said, "I told you I'd ask you properly." She felt her heart move in her chest like something waking up. He opened the paper package, and inside was a ring, small and simple, silver with a single turquoise stone set in it. The turquoise the color of the shallow places in the river where the sun hit the bottom, and he said, "This was my grandmother's. My mother sent it with her last letter because I told her what I intended, and she said my grandmother would have liked you because she had described you as a woman with good sense and a good heart, and my grandmother always said those were the only two things that mattered." Della looked at the ring and felt something move through her, full and complicated and clean. "Della Langley," he said, and he was looking at her with everything he had, all of it, nothing held back, and his voice was steady with the steadiness of something absolutely certain. "Will you do me the honor of being my wife?" She did not hesitate. She had done enough hesitating, enough waiting, enough holding herself carefully at the edge of things. She had loved Thomas with a real and good love, and she had grieved him with a full and real grief, and she had come through it to this porch on this February afternoon, and this man was kneeling in front of her, and she was entirely, unreservedly sure. "Yes," she said. "Henry, yes." He put the ring on her finger and stood up, and she stepped forward into him, and he held her in the cold February air with his face in her hair, and she could feel his heart beating against her chest, fast and real, and the world was very quiet around them. Copper Creek, as previously established, was efficient at noticing things. By Monday morning, the fact of the engagement was common knowledge from the dry goods store to the livery, and by Tuesday it had reached the Morrison Ranch north of town, and the Ortega family's laundry, and every pew of Reverend Gill's church, who was so transparently pleased with the news that his sermon that Sunday was barely coherent with his satisfaction. Mrs. Crane burst into happy tears when Della told her, which she had not expected and which touched her deeply. Harlan Briggs said, "About time," with the unabashed pleasure of a man taking full credit for something, and then pressed a jar of his preserved peaches into her hands as an engagement gift, which was somehow exactly right. The wedding was set for the first Saturday of May, which gave them just over 2 months, which Della thought was enough time to arrange things sensibly, and Henry thought was already slightly too long, which she told him was the most romantic thing he had said yet. The spring of 1880 came in gently, as if it understood the occasion. The mesquite bloomed, and the prairie grass went from tawny to green with the kind of bright insistence that always surprised her, even though it happened every year, and the whole of the world seemed to lean in the same direction, forward and warm and ready. Henry bought the northwest lot and began laying the foundation for a house, working with Frank Delacourt on the weekends and some evenings, and Della sometimes walked over and watched the work progress, the foundation turning to walls, the walls rising against the spring sky, and she felt a satisfaction in it that was specific and deep, the feeling of something being built for a future she could see clearly now. She kept her own property too. She had not seriously considered selling it to Prescott, but the conversation had settled something in her mind, that the land was hers and she wanted it to remain so, and Henry agreed without hesitation, saying there was no reason 2 pieces of land near each other couldn't belong to the same family and be worked together, and the ease with which he said, "the same family," made her press her lips together to contain the warmth of it. The Saturday morning of the wedding was the kind of May morning that people remember for the rest of their lives, not because anything dramatic happens, but because everything conspires to be perfect, the light soft and golden, the air carrying blossoms on the warm south wind, the sky a reliable and generous blue. Della dressed at her own house with Mrs. Crane helping her button the back of her dress, a new one in a cream-colored muslin with small blue flowers worked along the collar, which she had made herself over the previous weeks with more care than she had made anything in years. She looked at herself in the small mirror on the bedroom wall, and she thought of Thomas with a genuine and undramatic tenderness, the kind of thought you have for someone you have truly loved and truly let go, and she said quietly to his memory that she was happy, and she believed that wherever Thomas was, he was glad of it. Reverend Gill performed the ceremony in the church, which was filled to the point of informal, half the town having found a reason to be there, because Copper Creek took its wedding seriously, and this one had been anticipated for months. The Ortega family sat in the 3rd pew, and Maria Ortega cried cheerfully throughout, which Della found enormously touching. Henry was standing at the front of the church when she walked in, and he turned to look at her, and his face did the thing that faces do when a person sees something they have wanted badly and are now receiving, a kind of falling open, a transparency, and it was the most honest thing she had ever seen on another person's face, and she walked toward it like it was true north. The vows were the traditional words, but they said them to each other with a specificity and intention that made them sound new. And when Reverend Gill said, "You may kiss your bride," Henry kissed her with a gentle certainty that tasted like the whole of the winter and spring they had lived through together, and the church made sounds of approval that it had probably not made since its founding. The reception was held in the Grange Hall, the same hall where they had danced in October, and Jasper Collins was back with his fiddle and considerably more enthusiasm than the last time. And there was food and cider, and the particular happiness of a whole community being genuinely glad about something. And they danced together for the first time as husband and wife, and Della thought that of all the things she had expected her life to be, this had not been on the list. And it was better than anything that had been. They moved into the new house in July, which was not quite finished but livable, the kitchen and the main room and the bedroom complete, and the back room that Henry was building out for purposes they were thinking about in a practical and hopeful way. Della's house sat 40 acres to the east, and they worked both properties together, which proved to be the sensible arrangement Henry had said it would be. He planted a vegetable garden that dwarfed hers in scope, and she organized the planting schedule with the efficiency of someone who had been doing it alone for 2 years and found having a partner in it a revelation. Copernicus the mule was joined by 2 more horses, a practical bay mare named Rosamond who Henry bought for trail and field work, and a younger horse called August who was a project horse, energetic and unfinished, which Henry said he enjoyed, and which Rosamond tolerated with a philosophical detachment that Della admired. The autumn of 1880 arrived, a full year after Henry had appeared at her gate with a ladder, and they stood together one October morning in the yard of their new house and looked at the land around them, the prairie gold again in the fall light, the hills a darker amber, the mesquite holding onto its leaves with a certain reluctance, and she was aware of the full circle of it, the specific satisfaction of having lived a year in full and come around to the same light from the inside of a different life. 1 year ago today, Henry said, looking at the sky. More or less, she said. I fell off your roof, he said. You slid, she said. You didn't fully fall. You caught me. She looked at him. He was looking at the sky still, but she could see the smile at the corner of his mouth. Enough of you to matter, she said. He looked at her then, and the smile was full and unguarded. I called it fate, he said. I know you did, she said. I overheard you telling Harlan Briggs. He laughed genuinely, the good laugh that she had collected over the past year and kept carefully. What did Harlan say? He said he knew it when you asked him about my chimney, she said. Henry shook his head, grinning. That man is insufferable. He is, she agreed, and we owe him everything. She took his hand where it hung at his side, and he folded his fingers around hers, and they stood together in the October morning with the work of the day ahead of them, and the year behind them and all the years forward, waiting and good. In November of 1880, Della told Henry that she was expecting their first child, which she announced at the kitchen table of the new house over breakfast, setting her coffee cup down and folding her hands and saying, with the particular combination of calm and incandescence that was specific to her, I have something to tell you. He put his fork down and gave her his complete attention, the way he gave her his complete attention when she had something to say, which was one of the things she loved best about him. We're going to have a child, she said. The look on his face went through several rooms of feeling in the space of a second, surprise and joy and something that was almost overwhelmed, and then he reached across the table and covered her folded hands with both of his, and he said, Are you well? Are you feeling well? I'm feeling perfectly fine, she said, though mornings have been somewhat trying for the past 2 weeks. 2 weeks, he said, with the voice of a man recalculating the recent past. You've known for 2 weeks. I wanted to be certain, she said. He was quiet for a moment, his hand still over hers, and she watched something settle in his face that she had not seen before, a new layer of it, a depth that came from understanding that he was now responsible for something so profoundly important that all previous responsibility felt rehearsal-like by comparison. "I'm going to be a father," he said. "You are," she said. He got up from his chair and came around the table and crouched beside her chair and held her face in his hands and looked at her with everything he had, and she felt the enormity of the moment, not in a heavy way but in a full way, like a room that has been properly furnished at last, every space accounted for. "I love you," he said, "more than I have language for." "I know," she said. "I love you the same way." He kissed her forehead and then her mouth and then sat on the floor beside her chair, which made her laugh, and he put his head against her knee like a man who has just received something so good he needs a moment to be simply close to it, and she put her hand on his hair, and the kitchen was warm and quiet, and the morning light came in through the window in a long gold bar across the floor. The winter was gentle, or as gentle as West Texas winters managed to be, and Della's pregnancy progressed with the fundamental straightforwardness that characterized her approach to most things. She kept working, because she was not the kind of woman who sat quietly through anything, though she accepted Henry's insistence on handling the heavier tasks without too much argument, which was more generosity than he usually got from her on the subject of taking it easy. He wrote to his mother immediately, and the letter that came back in December was 2 full pages of Mrs. Wells's firm, clear handwriting, full of practical advice and warm feeling, and the specific joy of a woman who had hoped for grandchildren and was now receiving them. She said she intended to come to Texas in the spring to meet her daughter-in-law and meet the grandchild, and Henry read the letter to Della at the kitchen table, and they both felt the particular warmth of family reaching across distance. Mrs. Crane knitted a blanket over the winter, a serious blanket, dense and warm and large enough to last through several years of child, in a blue that she said matched Henry's eyes, which made Henry look simultaneously pleased and slightly embarrassed. And Harlan Briggs appeared at the door in February with a carved wooden rattle that he said he had made himself, though his hands were not particularly carpenter's hands, and Della treasured it without inquiring too deeply into its actual origin. The spring of 1881 came, and with it Henry's mother, Margaret Wells, who arrived on the train on a Thursday in April, a small, straight-backed woman of 58 with Henry's eyes and a way of taking in a room and assessing it that was so similar to Della's own method of doing things that they recognized each other immediately and correctly as 2 women who would get along perfectly. She stayed 3 weeks, sleeping in the room that had been finished at the back of the house, and in those 3 weeks she and Della established a friendship that was genuine and mutual and built on a shared appreciation for directness, good practical sense, and Henry's consistent, cheerful inability to put things away in the correct place. "He's been like this since he was 7, Margaret told Della one afternoon while Henry was out, gesturing at the workbench in the corner of the kitchen where Henry's miscellaneous tools and papers had accumulated. His father used to say he had a different understanding of where things belonged. He's excellent at building things precisely where they're supposed to be," Della said. "He's less consistent about where his hat goes." "His hat," Margaret said, with the weight of a woman who had found the hat in unreasonable places for 30 years. They understood each other completely. Margaret was there when the baby came, in the early hours of a warm May morning in 1881, a full 12 months after the wedding, and the labor was not easy but not extraordinary. And Della was the kind of woman who gritted her teeth and worked through things, and the doctor from town was there, and Mrs. Crane was there, and Henry was there, in the way that Henry was always there, solid and present and refusing to be sent away, holding her hand and talking quietly and being, in the crucial moment, exactly what she needed. The baby was a boy. He was born with Henry's eyes and a considerable pair of lungs, and a disposition that announced itself immediately as strongly opinionated, and Henry held him for the first time with the careful reverence of a man holding something that has no precedent in his experience. And he looked at his son, and then at Della, and the expression on his face was not something she would ever adequately describe in words, and she did not try. She simply looked back at him and felt the full sum of everything. They named him Thomas James Wells. Thomas for the man who had given Della the first framework of her life. James for Henry's middle name and for his father before him. It seemed right to carry both men forward into the new life, to let the past be part of the present without obscuring it. Margaret held her grandson with the competence and joy of a woman who had waited for this, and the look on her face was so openly, simply happy that Della felt her own eyes go wet, and Margaret looked at her and said, "Thank you, my dear," and meant something very large and very plain by it, and Della squeezed her hand and said, "Thank you for raising him." Copper Creek, as was its way, treated the birth of Thomas James Wells as a communal event of significance, and the house received a steady stream of visitors over the following weeks, each bringing food or gifts or simple congratulations, and Della accepted all of it with genuine gratitude, because she had learned over the past 2 years that community was not an abstraction but a specific and daily thing, built of small gestures and accumulated kindness. And she valued it as something you could not make by yourself. Henry was a good father. She had suspected he would be, from the way he was with everything he was responsible for, thorough and patient and genuinely interested, and the baby seemed to find in him a specific security, settling against his chest with a completeness that she watched sometimes from across the room with a warmth that was very nearly overwhelming in its ordinariness. He carried the boy on his rounds of the property, talking to him as he worked, describing what he was doing in a low, steady voice, the way a man talks who believes that the person listening is worth talking to. And Della overheard this one morning from the kitchen window and had to set down her bowl and just stand there for a moment with the feeling of it. Life in the house they had built together found its rhythm, the particular and unrepeatable rhythm of a specific family in a specific place. The way the mornings went, coffee before the baby woke, then the managed happy chaos of a baby who was awake, then Henry out to the land or the workshop, then her own work, the garden and the hens and the mending and the bread and the letters and the ledger book she kept for their combined properties, which she did with the clear-eyed precision of a woman who had learned accounting from necessity and found she had a talent for it. She took over keeping the books for Frank Delacourt's building business as well, doing it from home with Thomas strapped to her back in the carrier Margaret had sent from St. Louis, and Frank paid her a fair wage for it, and told Henry he was not sure the business could have run as well before, and Henry, to his credit, was not remotely surprised. The autumn of 1881 turned the prairie gold again, and Thomas was 5 months old and had discovered that the world contained interesting textures, and Henry found him one afternoon methodically mouthing the edge of a board left on the floor of the main room, and Henry picked him up and held him at arm's length and said, with the gravity of a man addressing a peer, "That's work material, not food." Thomas regarded his father with enormous blue eyes and offered an opinion about this that was not yet verbal but was very clear in its emotional content. "He disagrees," Della said from the doorway. "He is his mother's son," Henry said. "He is his father's son," she said. "Look at those eyes." Henry looked down at his son, who looked back at him with an expression of profound interest, and the love on Henry's face was so simple and complete that Della felt it from across the room. She crossed to where they were and leaned her head against Henry's shoulder, and he turned his face into her hair, and they stood there in the October afternoon with their son between them and the world outside doing its autumnal business. And she thought that this, precisely this, was what people meant when they talked about a life. Not the dramatic moments, though those had their place, but this, the ordinary afternoon, the baby and the board that was work material and not food. The shoulder and the hair and the warmth and the specific irreplaceable arrangement of the three of them, in this room, in this house, on this land, at this exact point in time. By the following spring, Thomas was walking, lurching from surface to surface with the triumphant determination of someone who has just discovered an important technology and is not going to let a lack of perfect control slow the application of it. And Henry modified the lower shelves in the kitchen so nothing breakable or dangerous was within reach. And Copernicus, the mule, had developed a specific and inexplicable fondness for the boy. Lowering his large gray head over the fence whenever Thomas was carried past, in a way that suggested the mule had also decided this was fate. In the spring of 1882, Della found herself expecting again, and she told Henry in the same kitchen, at the same table, in the manner that had established itself as their way of delivering important information, the folded hands and the complete attention, and he received it with the same warmth as before, seasoned now with the confidence of a man who has done this once and knows the road, and he said, "Thomas will have someone to argue with." Which was so precisely the right thing to say that she laughed until she had to put her head on the table. This pregnancy was different in the way that second pregnancies often are, a slight easiness about it, a familiarity, and she moved through the summer and fall of 1882 with the pragmatic calm of a woman who has learned to trust her own body's competence. Henry fussed in the specific quiet way he had of fussing, making sure wood was split and stored before she needed to ask, ensuring the water situation was never her problem to solve, coming home from workshop jobs earlier than strictly necessary, because he had calculated that Thomas was a handful for a woman in her 8th month, and he was not wrong about that. The baby came in December of 1882, a daughter this time, and they named her Margaret Eliza Wells, for Henry's mother and for Mrs. Crane, who burst into the most thorough happy tears yet, and who had to sit down in the kitchen for a full 5 minutes with her handkerchief before she could speak, and who then said something about it being the greatest honor and nothing being able to match this, and Della held her hand and agreed entirely. Margaret Eliza was from the first moment a different kind of person than Thomas, quieter and more observant, lying in her basket studying the ceiling with an intensity that made Henry say she was either going to be a philosopher or an engineer, and Della said those were not mutually exclusive, and Henry agreed that was fair. Thomas, at 18 months, was intrigued by his sister in the way of children who are trying to determine where a new thing fits in the established system, and he circled her basket with a researcher's concentration for the first 3 days, and then apparently reached a conclusion, because after that he treated her with a proprietary care that was simultaneously endearing and slightly territorial, bringing her things and then taking them back and then bringing them again, which seemed to satisfy some internal protocol of his. Copper Creek had changed in the years since Della had arrived, grown in the way of Texas frontier towns in the late 1870s and early 1880s, more houses and more businesses, and the railroad finally doing some of what it had promised, bringing goods and people, and the specific energy of a place that is deciding what it intends to become. The injustices that had always been present were more visible as the town grew, the ways in which the Ortega family and others like them were constrained and condescended to even as their labor built the place. And Della spoke her mind about this at town meetings in a way that made some people uncomfortable and other people grateful. And Henry stood beside her at those meetings and added his voice to hers, because he believed what she believed, and because a man who stays quiet when his wife is right is not a man she would want. Frank Delacourt hired 3 Mexican laborers for a major building project in the spring of 1883, paying them the same wage he paid anyone, because Della had made an accounting argument about the cost of unfair wages to community cohesion that Frank had followed with his business instincts, even if he hadn't followed it entirely with his conscience, which she counted as a victory of a pragmatic kind. The years moved the way years move when you are living them fully, in a rush of seasons and small events and growth and change and loss. The way Harlan Briggs finally slowed down in the autumn of 1883, his health going the way of a man in his 60s who has worked hard all his life without quite enough rest. And Della brought him food and sat with him in his room above the dry goods store and talked with him about Kentucky and Copper Creek and the particular satisfaction of watching something grow that you had a hand in. And when he died that November, it was peacefully and surrounded by people who genuinely loved him. And the town felt his absence the way you feel the absence of a piece of furniture that you never particularly thought about, but that turned out to have been holding the room together. She stood at his grave on a cold November day with Henry's hand in hers and Thomas at her side and Margaret Eliza, now almost a year old, on Henry's arm. And she thought about the jar of preserved peaches that Harlan had brought as an engagement gift, and the bushy eyebrows and the contradictory stories about Kentucky. And she was grateful for him in the specific and particular way you are grateful for the people who put their thumb on the scale of fate at the right moment. Henry built a bench for Harlan's grave, a simple cedar bench set a few feet back so a person could sit there in good weather and have a bit of company with the old man, and he set it in himself on a cold December morning, and Della thought it was the best thing she had ever seen him build. By 1884, the house had been expanded, the back room turned into a proper bedroom for the children, and a new room added off the kitchen for Henry's tools and books, and the various projects he always had in states of completion. And the property had established itself as a working piece of land with a vegetable garden that was the envy of the region, 2 milk cows named Grace and Persistence, the mule Copernicus who was aging philosophically, 3 horses, a dog named Brick who had appeared out of the prairie one day and decided the Wells property was where he lived now, and enough chickens to supply the family and have surplus for trade. Thomas was 3.5 and had his father's directness, and his mother's refusal to accept an inadequate explanation for anything. And Margaret Eliza was 18 months, and had discovered language with an enthusiasm that expressed itself in a constant, thoughtful running commentary on whatever she was observing, which everyone found charming until they were trying to sleep. Della kept the books for Frank Delacourt's business, and had taken on 2 other accounts as well, running her bookkeeping work from the kitchen table with a competence and precision that had begun to generate a reputation beyond Copper Creek. And she had been formally consulted twice by business owners in neighboring towns, which she managed by letter and occasional short trips, and which represented both the practical independence she had always valued and the specific satisfaction of being known for something she had built herself. Henry was finishing his best year of building work, he and Frank having taken on the construction of a new schoolhouse for Copper Creek's growing population of children, which Henry approached with a particular investment, the building being where his own children would learn to read and calculate and argue properly. And he put into it the kind of care that reflected everything he believed about the future being worth building carefully. They were sitting on the porch of their house one evening in October of 1884, with the children in bed and the night air carrying the smell of cooling earth and the last of the summer's grass, and the stars doing what Texas stars did, which was refuse to be modest about it, and Della was leaning against Henry's shoulder, and he had his arm around her, and they were quiet in the way they had learned to be quiet together, which was not empty but full. 5 years ago, she said. He tilted his head against hers, more or less. You came with a ladder, she said, and a good set of tools, he said, and you fell off my roof, she said. I slid, he said, for the 100th time. There is a distinction. I caught you, she said. Enough of me to matter, he said. She turned her head to look at him. He was already looking at her, the blue eyes in the starlight, the face she had watched across 1,000 mornings and evenings and small, ordinary moments until it was more familiar to her than her own, and she felt the 5 years like a country she had traveled through and that had claimed her back. And you called it fate, she said. I did, he said, without any hesitation, any qualification. Because it was. She settled back against his shoulder and felt the solid warmth of him, and the solid dark of the October night, and the specific and daily miracle of a life that had turned out to contain all of this. This man and this house and these children and this land and this community. All of it built from the improbable beginning of a man who had arrived at her gate with a ladder over his shoulder and fallen off her roof before he was done with the job. "I think," she said, "that I would have found you anyway. Even without the chimney." "Would you?" he said, and she could hear the smile. "I think the universe was less organized about it than you give it credit for," she said. "I think it was fate in the sense of two people being the right match and being in the same town at the right time and someone giving the information about the chimney to the right person. That's still fate," he said. "That's a series of practical coincidences," she said. "Della," he said, and he pressed his lips to her temple, "when a man falls off a roof and the woman he's going to love catches him, that is fate. I'm not going to argue this point." She smiled against his shoulder. "No," she said. "I don't suppose you are." The night went on around them, the stars turning in their slow particular wheel, the prairie breathing its dry, vast breath, the children sleeping in the house behind them with the unconscious certainty of children who have never had a reason to doubt that the world is safe, and the people who love them are close by. And Henry and Della Wells sat together on the porch of the house he had built, and she had made into the truest kind of home, and were entirely, quietly, completely happy. In the years that followed, Thomas Wells grew into a boy who built things and argued pleasantly, and had an instinct for fairness that delighted his parents and sometimes drove his teachers to distraction. Margaret Eliza, called Maggie by everyone and fiercely correct about this, became the family's resident commentator, a child so observant and articulate that visiting adults often had the unsettling experience of feeling that she had assessed them accurately and would remember her conclusions. A third child came in 1886, another son, named Daniel Frank Wells, with Frank Delacourt's name included in sincere tribute to the man who had given Henry his start in Copper Creek. And Daniel arrived with his mother's green-brown eyes and a temperament of such fundamental cheerfulness that the household seemed measurably brighter after he appeared in it. Henry finished the schoolhouse in the spring of 1885, and it stood on its corner of Copper Creek's main square with the solid, careful pride of a building that knew it had been made well. And Thomas started his lessons there that fall, and Henry walked him to the door on the first morning and shook his son's hand at the gate in the sober way of a man who respects the significance of a threshold. And Thomas shook his father's hand back with equal seriousness. And Della watched from the road and felt the particular love that has no language, only the pressure of it, warm behind her ribs. Mrs. Crane lived to see all three Wells children born, and passed away in the winter of 1887, quietly in her own house, with Della beside her, and left Della her good blue tea service, which had been her finest possession, and which Della used on every occasion that called for good china and some that didn't, because Mrs. Crane had believed that the good things were for using. Frank Delacourt retired from the business in 1888 and signed it over to Henry for a price so fair it was nearly a gift, and Henry ran it with the same partnership of practical competence and honest dealing that had characterized the operation from the beginning, taking on an apprentice, a young man of 17 named Eli Reyes, the eldest son of a family that had come up from Mexico 2 years before, and who had a talent for joinery that Henry recognized immediately, and had no patience with anyone who tried to suggest was not worth developing because of where the boy came from. Della ran the books for the business with the same precision she had always brought to it, and her bookkeeping practice had by then become known enough that she had a genuine client roster and a reputation for finding the places where numbers revealed what management refused to admit, which was valuable to anyone who wanted to know the truth about their business and slightly alarming to those who didn't. In the autumn of 1889, Copper Creek prepared to mark the decade's end, and the town had grown and changed and was still recognizably itself. The same place where Harlan Briggs had told Henry Wells about a woman's chimney that needed fixing, though Harlan himself was 10 years gone, and the dry goods store had passed to a nephew who was competent if not as distinctively eyebrowed. Henry and Della stood together at the end of October in the yard of their house, the same yard where she had stood when she first saw him slide off the roof, though the yard was different now, the garden established, and the trees that Henry had planted in their first year together grown tall enough to offer real shade. The children's voices coming from inside the house where Thomas, now 8, was attempting to teach Maggie, 7, a card game, and Daniel, 3, was enthusiastically ruining both efforts. The ladder was still in the barn. She had kept it. He did not know this, and when she mentioned it that October evening casually, as one mentions a thing that has simply been there, he looked at her with an expression that moved through surprise into something much warmer and then into the particular kind of love that has a full decade behind it, seasoned and deepened by time and children and quarrels and laughter and the shared daily weight of building something real. "You kept the ladder," he said. "It's a perfectly good ladder," she said. "Della." She looked at him with the composed, direct gaze she had given him across every table and porch and yard for 10 years. "Someone has to keep the things that matter," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. The October light was the same amber it had been when they had first stood in this yard together, and it lit his face the same way, and he was 10 years older and 10 years more known to her than he had been, and she loved him with a fullness and a solidity that had nothing precarious about it anymore, nothing of the first tentative weight of new feeling. It was something settled and certain, and as much a part of the structure of her life as the chimney he had fixed on that first morning. He stepped forward and took her face in his hands, the same hands that had been in leather gloves she made him on their first Christmas, the same hands that had held Thomas and then Maggie and then Daniel for the first time, the same hands that had built the house around them and the bench at Harlan's grave and the schoolhouse on the square. And he looked at her with everything he had, all of it, a full decade of everything, and he said, "I love you, Della Wells. I have loved you since you picked up that ladder." "Since I caught you," she said. "Since you caught enough of me to matter," he said. She put her hands over his on her face and held them there and felt the October air and the evening coming on and the sound of her children inside the house and the mule in the barn and the smoke from the chimney that drew clean and true and had for 10 years. And she thought that fate was, in the end, not a distant or mysterious thing, not a force operating on you from outside, but the name you give to the sum of the small choices and the right moments and the people who show up with ladders when you need them, who fall in ways that let you catch them, who come back the next week to finish the job properly. "I know," she said, and she did. She had always known. He kissed her in the October yard, unhurried, with the ease of a man kissing the woman he has kissed 1,000 times and intends to kiss 1,000 more. And behind them, the house they had built together stood in the evening light with its smoke curling straight and clean from the chimney into the amber Texas sky. And inside it 3 children made their various entertainments and arguments and commentaries. And the future stretched out in front of Henry and Della Wells like land you have not yet walked, but already know is yours, wide and solid and lit by the same good light that had been falling on this corner of the world since before any of them arrived and would go on falling long after. Indifferent to their small particular happiness and somehow, in that indifference, making it more precious. They had everything they needed and they knew it, which is the rarest thing. The chimney still worked perfectly. It always would.